If the ancient stories of giants are rooted in ancestral memory, it would be reasonable to expect giant remains to have been found. Giant human-like remains have indeed been found, and in particular in the Americas. In the USA, between 1819 and 1859, giant remains were unearthed in Missouri, Ohio, West Virginia, Iowa, California, and Pennsylvania. These finds were reported in the newspapers and for a time were curated by the Smithsonian Institute before being repatriated. But what exactly were they? The height of 9 to 13 to 15 feet is anomalous, and details like 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, plus double rows of teeth or molar-type teeth, suggest something other than Homo sapiens. And it's intriguing that these details do repeat in contemporary reports and contemporary finds. The red hair, the height, the number of fingers, the kinds of teeth, these details repeat in biblical descriptions, in Josephus 2,000 years ago, and out of Kandahar in our own period. What do these correlations mean?
I love this series just because it's so bizarre and so unique, and the things that we're covering. As you saw in the opening clip that we play every week, we've talked about Philip being present during a baptism and then he disappears, almost like teleportation. We've talked about Sodom and Gomorrah and the evidence that has been found. And today, we're talking about giants. So not only are giants part of folklore, like Jack and the Giant Beanstalk, but as stated in the opening clip, they've actually become part of our pop culture. It's present in our time period as well. The History Channel released a docu-series in 2014 that I actually really liked watching, but it was titled Search for the Lost Giants, where there's a group of individuals that were trying to find skeletal remains or any kind of tangible evidence that would support that large beings actually existed in history, that they weren't just derived from mythological stories. Now, the overall description of giants in regards to what we understand about them in history or in myths is it varies, right? You have normal human-looking beings that are extremely tall. They look just like you and I, only significantly taller. To human beings or people that look like human beings, but they have abnormalities. You know, they might have 2 layers of teeth, maybe 1 extra finger or toe, and maybe sometimes with a single large eye socket, right? It just depends on the idea that you have of a giant. In America, we have our own version of a giant, and it's a mix of a human and an ape. We call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot, right? It's a giant human being. And it's a large bipedal being that typically measures somewhere between 8 to 10 plus feet. That's typically the measurements that are given. Now, these cryptids are said to have unrealistic strength, able to carry like large stones and throwing them and just being able to do things that defy our natural ability. And these beings are believed to either, depending on the stories that you read in history, sometimes they're protectors of the village. They're not malevolent, they're benevolent. They're good people to have around. And in some other cultures, they're seen as malevolent. They're not good people to actually have around because you don't want to mess with them or you end up dying. I know that how some of you feel about Bigfoot in the room, but at the same time, not everybody in the room agrees with us. But they think that we're crazy. But these are the same people that believe that giants exist, and they sound as crazy as us to other people. They sound like they're saying that they believe in Bigfoot. So the Bible describes giants. What do you do with that, right? I mean, if you don't believe in Bigfoot, and I'm not telling you what you should or shouldn't believe about him, but one of the things that's interesting is, as Christians, really we have to understand that a lot of the things that the Bible describes does make us sound weird because we believe in giants. And the funny thing about it is that as you begin to search online, all right, so when you begin to search about evidence to support what the Bible claims, or just about things that are on the fringe, you will find that giants are not as uncommon as one would think. You will find modern day stories of people who have claimed to see giants. And they are not people that stand in the street corner with a sign that says the end is near. They're actually people that have a little bit more credibility than that. As a matter of fact, right after the turn of the century, into the 2000s, in 2004, there was a record of an incident that occurred in the mountains of Afghanistan. And it's a record that is pretty unique. According to the eyewitness, they actually claim to have seen a red-headed, it's always redheads, but a red-headed giant that measured about 13 feet, and it had long hair, and it was in a cave. And this is where the story goes from weird to kind of interesting. The eyewitness, once again, was not the person in the street corner that is holding a sign that makes everybody feel uncomfortable. The eyewitness of this event was actually not even part of that region of Afghanistan. The person that actually made this claim about this incident was actually a Green Beret from the United States Army. And he was part of that battalion. Now, it's really interesting because the story as it goes is they were going in search of an individual who had gone missing, and they recovered the body of that individual, which was not something worth, I would say, putting in a funeral casket. Maybe that's the best way to put it. And they end up seeing this individual, and they see this giant individual come out of the cave. And that's when they end up taking the giant out. And interestingly enough, they end up recovering the body. But they claim that they have seen it. One man lost his life. And once again, they take the giant down. They carry the body and the remains away from it. Now, this is where the story goes from interesting to conspiracy. And I know that right now, it seems like we're not even going to talk about the Bible. Trust me, we are. But this all ties together. The individuals that actually saw this, they claim to have been forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement, meaning that they could never talk about it. And eventually when they did, the disclosure that came out about the man that they claimed to have been killed by this giant, it was reported that supposedly that man died because he was pretty much shredded by a bomb. So once again, there are stories like this on the internet that circulate, maybe not as specific as this one, but there are many stories if you go down that rabbit trail. You will find these stories that are either first-hand eyewitness accounts, or if not, the stories are not so far back in history that they seem just ridiculous. And in the beginning, you actually saw or heard about one story of how there was actually giant remains that were found and given to the Smithsonian Museum, and then eventually the Smithsonian Museum ended up saying that they had actually lost those bones and they had no records of it. So once again, it's pretty interesting, but all that to say is giants are pretty immersed into our culture. Maybe you haven't seen it, but they're out there, right? In regards to the History Channel and other different TV shows focus on these things. They're very much part of pop culture. Now, the interesting part is that when I grew up in the church, my mom and my sisters would go every Sunday, and I remember hearing the stories that we've talked about in this series, right? And to me, they were just normal. One of the stories that I grew up learning is the one that we're tackling today. It's the story of a giant by the name of Goliath who was slayed by a boy by the name of David. Now, this boy ultimately went up against not just a person who was huge, but it was a giant warrior. It was somebody that ultimately was military background, right? They could defend themselves. And David ends up defeating Goliath. Now, if I am recalling this correct, I think that they kept it rated G when I was growing up, because I don't remember hearing about David cutting off the head of Goliath. That came later in youth group. But once again, I remember hearing that story. And once again, giants are part of the biblical narrative. We hear it, we see it, and it's part of what we grew up hearing about if you grew up within the church. So now you have pop culture, you have history, and you have the church that is claiming these things that really seem fringe, right? They're kind of in the outskirts of weird. And you kind of come to this story and you think, well, it's a phenomenal account of the underdog that comes on top, right? Here you have this little guy who defeats this giant man, and he's the underdog that defeats, even though that's not what the story's about. This story in itself, which we're going to be tackling again today, it's really interesting because this biblical account is used in many sermons, is used in many Bible studies, and typically the way that these messages go, or these Bible studies go, they address insecurities, how we could defeat our insecurities, maybe how we could overcome our struggles, or maybe even how we can deal with the uncertainties of life, right? The giant in your life. But once again, that's kind of the way that they frame the story. That's how we convey the story so that it seems relatable to us. But that's not really the point. But before we get to the point of the story, let's start with the claim. So in this series, we've kind of looked at the bizarre, unique details and tried to see if there's any evidence for it in history, or even in regards to is it something that we can substantiate, something that we can solidify, that we can get to the point if we simply look in history. So that's where I want to start today, right? Is there any evidence? Because we've heard about it, right? We heard about it in history. I told you about a story that took place in 2004 in the mountains of Afghanistan, and it was substantiated by the Green Beret. So you have these stories. Now the question is there any evidence to actually support that giants exist? And for my friends who are Bigfoot fans, we're not talking about today. We'll talk about that some other time. But that's when we're not at church. And we're talking about aliens as well. No, I'm just kidding. So, once again, is there any evidence? So before we get to that, before we get to the whole idea of giants, we have to understand, what is a giant, right? What are you trying to find? So the battle of David and Goliath is actually found in the first book of Samuel, chapter 17. That's where you're going to find the account. And we're not going to read through the whole account. We're actually going to be focusing only on 3 verses today, because those are the main verses that really kind of nail everything together of what we're tackling. But in order to know if biblical giants exist, you have to understand what you're even looking for. So I want to encourage you throughout the week, make sure and study 1 Samuel chapter 17. That's where you're going to find the battle of David and Goliath, and you're going to get more details about this. But once again, in order to know what we're looking for, let's try to figure out what we're actually looking for. What kind of human are we looking for? How big is he? So the answer is found in verse 4 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it says this: "And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." I stated this during the flood account. Those kind of measurements really don't help us out because we really don't know what a cubit is. We don't measure in that way. But we talked about it during the flood account as to how big it was supposed to be. It gave us a measurement in cubits. The cubit is actually the length between your fingertips and your elbow. That's a cubit. So it's estimated to be around 16 inches. And like I've said many times before, and I'll say it again, I can't say that I've been criticized as much as it's been noted that one of the things that I do on Sunday mornings is that I preach out of the New Living Translation, the NLT. We've talked about the different translations of the Bible. Many churches probably use the ESV, which is a word-for-word translation, which is good. Knowing Spanish and English, I could tell you that it's good to translate word for word, but it's not helpful when you're trying to get a point across. Sometimes it's easier to kind of derive the thought behind of it, so then you understand what it's saying. Some people are KJV only, and there's many reasons for it, which we've talked about in the past. And the reason that I say this is because what we just read is giving us the size of a giant. And the problem is, how do we know how tall he was according to cubits? If you look at your footnote, it'll tell you what a cubit is, and then you could do the math. But the easier way to get the measurement is by going to the New Living Translation, which is easier to not only preach out of, but it's also easier for you to understand, even though I use multiple translations. So here's what it says. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. It's just going to give you the measurement, right, in our modern language. So now we understand what we're looking for in a giant is somebody that is 9 feet tall. That's huge. Actually, as a matter of fact, right now where I'm standing to the ceiling, it's 8 feet. If you were to go all the way to the floor, to the ceiling, it's 10 feet. So just shy of that. So imagine you're looking like straight up and, here's this giant that you're going to be facing. So a better way to put the size of Goliath is he was like a baby Squatch, right? He's just a tiny little guy in Squatch proportions. But is it possible that there is somebody that big? Well, you don't have to go that far in history to realize that there was. A man by the name of Robert Wadlow was actually the largest man to have ever walked in recorded history, in recent history. Now, he actually grew up to be 8 foot 11 inches. That's 9 feet, right? And Goliath was just a little bit over 9 feet tall. So if you're looking for skeletal remains, you just have to go, I believe he was either from Michigan or Wisconsin, but you just have to go to his remains and you'll find that, yeah, giants exist in that sense. Now, when you base it on that, it's not really hard to say, well, it's possible. It's actually not far-fetched to say that giants existed. If the Alton giant, which is what Robert Wadlow was known as, the Alton giant, would have actually just had like a little mohawk, he would have reached 9 feet tall, right? They would have been like back to back. And it's interesting because we can actually make the argument pretty quickly, you're probably going to find skeletal remains of people that were that tall, because it's not far-fetched. But when we get into the details of what the Bible is describing in contrast to what we find in history, we're going to run into issues. Because the Bible states that Goliath was actually a man of war. He was a warrior. And he was actually a man who was capable of fighting. Now, you could look at Shaquille O'Neal, who I believe is like 7 feet something maybe, and you could say, well, he moves just fine. But when we're looking at a man of war that is 9 feet tall, something that's going to happen is you're going to run into issues if you base it on Robert Wadlow, the Alton giant. If you look at people that have this condition of gigantism, you realize that their height is not something that is beneficial to them as much as it is something that becomes a difficulty for them in life. It was actually because of his height that led to his death at the age of 22. That's the reason that Robert Wadlow died. And the reason that he died was because as your body continues to grow, his nervous system can't keep up with him, right? So what ended up happening is he had some braces that were put into his body, right, to support him, that ultimately became his demise. As these braces rubbed, it developed an infection, but his nervous system didn't catch it in time, so he ended up dying because of the infection that was caught too late. So if we look at it in a biblical perspective, it's really hard to make the association that maybe what Goliath had was this gigantism as we know it. If we actually look at the medical field, as we've grown to understand more about the development of height and everything, one of the things that we understand is that gigantism, or this being able to be so tall, comes from the pituitary gland that ultimately causes that to continue to go. You can get as high as possible because there's an issue with that. And once again, Robert Wadlow, as you see videos of him, you'll notice he's kind of slow walking. And if you look at stories of his life, one of the things that's interesting is he actually was very much loved. So he's not very threatening, but imagine trying to fight somebody like that. If you see him move, you would realize, even though I'm not a fighter, I could probably still beat him, right? Because it doesn't benefit him. It hurts him. So if we look at history and if we find remains of that height, we could say, well, there's the evidence. Well, if it's Robert Wadlow, yeah, you're close to 9 feet. But the issue is that person had a condition that ultimately would not have allowed him to be necessarily that great at war, because there's issues. But that's not what the Bible is claiming, right? So that's what's really interesting about the Bible. When you find these accounts, it really does help you to narrow the search. The Bible gives us this detail to understand that Goliath's height was not a result of the pituitary gland, but it's something different. So during the time of Noah, right before the flood account, the Bible states that in those days, and sometime after, giant Nephilites, the Nephilim, lived on the earth. For whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times. I love this verse during our Areopagus time during the summer, where we get together and talk about different things in the Bible. We talked about this, and it kind of led down a rabbit trail, which I love talking about. But here's the best way that we can understand this. The height of the giants who lived on the earth at the time was attributed to what we can consider crossbreeding. And I'm going to get back to that in just a second. I know it sounds weird, but I'll come back to it and expand on what I'm saying. Before we get to that, here's the issue. My aunt and I had this, between my mom, my aunt, and I, we had this conversation, but there are people who believe that what is explained in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, the Nephilim, they believe that the sons of God is not talking about angels, more specifically fallen angels. It's talking about human beings who were not in Christ. And that's the reason that the world got messed up. There's many issues with that theory. I don't adhere to it. I think that it's problematic. More specifically, the reason why is because no matter how lost you are, two human beings having a child will not cause some kind of weird defect, right? Or some kind of abnormality. So that's already an issue there. And once again, you could study other passages, and it's easy to conclude that what the Bible is talking about here in Genesis is talking about fallen angels. You see it in the book of Job, where it refers to the angels as the sons of God. So what we're talking about here is fallen angels. You see it again in Jude, where it talks about the angels that refuse to remain within the boundaries that were given to them. So I know it's weird, but this is what it's talking about. It's talking about women who were having children of fallen angels. Now, that leads into a totally different topic, which we tackled again in Areopagus. That's the reason that I love doing that, because I get to weird out in these things. But the verse tells us that based on this relationship, these individuals that became the offspring of the daughters of men and the sons of God, the fallen angels, ended up becoming the famous warriors and the heroes of old. That's who they were. And they seem to possess some kind of either supernatural ability or supernatural strength. And this is what fits in the category of Goliath. That's what we're talking about. Here's where it gets a little bit interesting. And now I'm going to you're going to have to follow me on this because we're getting to the point. But this is where we're going to get a little bit weird. We're actually going to be talking about the book of Enoch really quickly in just a second. But one thing that we have to understand before we even get to the concept of giants is that the word Nephilim does translate to the word giant. That is the word. But here is something that at times is not mentioned. It can also translate to two other words. It could translate to tyrant, and it could translate to bully. What was Goliath doing? He was bullying the people of Israel, right? Now, once again, not only is a Nephilim a giant, but it could also be line up with what the Philistines were doing. They are tyrants, they are bullying, and this is something that is significant in considering, right? Maybe it's not that Goliath was that tall. Maybe he was tall, but that was not the case. And I know that it seems like I'm kind of backing away from that weirdness of it. Trust me, I'm coming back to it. But you have to understand this, because something that happens within the church, and this is the reason that I love our church, this is the reason that I love Epicenter, is because we want to empower you to defend your faith, right? I'd rather speak a message of truth biblically than speak a message of encouragement that is partially biblical, but at the same time, it's not going to help you defend the faith that you claim. I've talked about this in the past, but this next generation, the best way to put it is they're screwed. And here's the reason why. Because we're not training them to defend the faith. We're training them to believe in a God that is going to do everything that they want without understanding the God that they actually worship. And as they get to college, their faith will be challenged. As you come across friends who are atheists or agnostic, or maybe don't believe the same thing you do, your faith will be challenged. And how do you stand up to that? Now, you could just say, well, I just believe what I believe, and it doesn't matter what they say. Good. That is faith. But at the same time, in 1 Peter, it says that we should always be ready to give an answer for the faith that we have in Christ Jesus. So it's important to understand why you believe what you believe. So understand that the word can mean tyrant, and it could also mean bully, but at the same time, here is another issue. And this is the reason that I love this topic. Because you could just say, well, Goliath was 9 feet tall, just as I did. But as you begin to study this topic, one of the things that you will come across, and maybe will even be challenged on by somebody that maybe studies the Bible a little bit better than you to disprove that it's good and accurate, they might bring up the fact that Goliath's height varies depending on the historical account, even biblically. One of the things that you will find is that 9 feet is not the absolute measurement that is given in the Bible. The website God Questions, which is a great resource, godquestions.org, it's a great resource for those who have many questions regarding the Bible, but it does a great job at really pointing out one of the uncertainties about Goliath's height. And they state this, I'm going to put it up there, but it states, a Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, records Goliath's height as 4 cubits and 1 span, right? We had 6. Now we get 4. Current measurements would translate to about 6 feet, 6 inches. That's about 3 feet shorter, right? I mean, I'm 6'1". That's significantly shorter. While this would shorten Goliath's some, he would still have been quite a bit taller than the average man's height at the time, about 5.5 feet. There are other sources that corroborate the shorter measurement, including one Hebrew text among the Dead Sea Scrolls and the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus. The NET Bible, NET Bible, that's the translation, goes with a shorter height, saying that Goliath was close to 7 feet tall. Do you understand why it's important to talk about these things, right? Because if you say, well, I'm looking for a giant that's 9 feet, but the Bible is describing a giant that's 6.5 feet, it won't take much creativity to try to find a Goliath of that stature. And it's a huge difference. I mean, you're not talking about inches, you're talking about feet. We are talking about abnormal growth, and this is huge. Now, of course, it's already mentioned there, but it would be, I mean, you could say, well, if I were to go to certain places around the world, I'm going to tower everybody because I'm 6'1" and they're probably going to be like 4'3", right? As you go to Mexico to like the ranches, I towered my great grandma by a lot. Like she was short. So once again, am I a giant? Well, depending on where you're at, right? If I go to an NBA game, I'm David. You know, they're Goliaths because they're huge. They're 7 feet tall. So one of the things that we have to understand is that the measurement is not, it does vary. And people will use this to say, exactly, there's my point. The Bible is unreliable. That's not the case. That's simply not the case. There's actually 2 possible answers to this. So for one, you have to understand that in the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and one of the things that you have to understand is that when in the translation, there may have been a variation in the height. Now, we talked about this during the flood account when we talk about how the measurement of Noah's Ark, that is believed to be Noah's Ark, in Turkey, they have said, well, if it was an Egyptian cubit, then it would measure out perfectly. How does that make a difference? Because the cubit is not an exact measurement. You have to understand that. If you and I were to put our hands that way, it's going to vary. That's the span of a cubit. So once again, you have to understand that we don't know for sure, but that's a possible answer. That's the cubit is not exact. You have to understand that. Now, the second thing is that we have to understand that that's not the important part of it. And even though it's important to us, that's not what the story's trying to convey. And it's going to change how we're going to view this story, right? If you have a 6-foot man and you picture Goliath, who would have been a young boy, he's not old, he's a young boy, you're talking about a very big difference, right? Now, it changes the way that we view the story, but it's not changing the approach of what the story's trying to convey. And I want to state this just to be clear. I believe personally, I am convinced that the Bible is describing an individual who towered everyone. I believe that it's talking about a 9-foot giant. I am convinced of that. And I believe that it's what it's describing, right? What the Nephilim came to be. And the reason for it, that I believe that it could be an abnormal growth that is ungodly to anything that we've seen, is because of the way that this breed of individuals, known as the Nephilim, happened. It was a relationship between the daughters of men and the sons of God. So I'm going to come back to what I talked about earlier, that I said it sounds weird, but at the same time, I believe there's evidence to substantiate it. I'm going to entertain this quickly, and then I'm going to move on, just to prove the point. As our understanding of genetics has definitely taken leaps, one thing that we have come to realize is that genetic splicing is possible. You're able to ultimately alter certain things. And crossbreeding often develops into interesting things. For example, many of us have heard of the mule. Do we know what a mule is? It's actually a crossbreed. It is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. That's what you get when you crossbreed both. You get a mule. Now, if you reverse that, what you end up when you cross a female donkey with a male horse, you end up with a hinny. You don't end up with a mule again. You end up with something different. It's interesting how when you cross both, you end up with something different. Now, you might say, well, it's still kind of the same. No, it's not. One source stated that mules are more robust than hinnies due to their larger build. Why? Because genetics play a factor. We even see this between the liger and the tigon. A liger is a hybrid offspring of a male lion and a female tiger, where a tigon is a hybrid of the male tiger and the female lion. It's confusing, right? But at the same time, you're hearing there's crossbreeding taking place, and you're getting something different. Now, here's the interesting thing. Ligers are bigger than tigons. Why would that make a difference? All the time. Because genetics makes a difference. Why would the Bible record that detail? Because it's telling you this is what's causing that abnormality of the Nephilim. And well, this intrigues us, right? I mean, we could talk about this forever. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that outside of the account of David and Goliath and the scouts that go into the promised land and they say, hey, we look like grasshoppers among this people because they're giants, right? Outside of those two accounts, there really isn't much more that the Bible talks about regarding giants. That's it. As a matter of fact, we can learn very little off of the 66 books of the Bible, the canon, which is a Christian Bible. It is not until you bring in Enoch that you get more details that are a lot more bizarre. Now, I've talked about this in the past. We've talked about it during the Areopagus, which is now done, but where we talked about these interesting concepts of the Bible or questions about faith. But I'm not going to go into all the inconsistencies of the Bible. But here's one issue if you really want to take Enoch and consider it divinely inspired, if you want to believe that it's actually part of the Bible. Let me just start off by saying this. One of the biggest issues is that Enoch claims that he is the Son of God, and that he is the Messiah. So Jesus is not the Messiah. According to the book of Enoch, which is pseudepigrapha, he claims to be the Son of God. So that's already issue number one. But let me go to issue number two, since we're talking about giants. According to Enoch, or First Enoch 7, the giants described there would have actually towered Goliath by a ton. The measurement that is given for the giants in the book of Enoch is an astonishing 3,000 ells, or approximately 450 feet tall, right? I mean, I believe in giants, but come on. I mean, that's a little insane. It's significantly different. So, with that being said, Enoch really is not divinely inspired. It's interesting. Jude references to it, which we've talked about, but it's not divinely inspired. So, with that being said, I do believe that archaeological evidence does exist to support what the Bible claims, whether it's skeletal remains or something different. As a matter of fact, there's even been like giant spears that have been found, and of course, the mainstream archaeologists say, well, it was just decorative, but when you consider the biblical narrative, it actually fits with what the Bible describes. But one of the issues that you'll run into as you start to try to find evidence to support the biblical giants is that when you try to siphon through all the information that's online, you're going to come across many hoaxes. It's going to be difficult to try to find reliable sources. And based on the hoaxes, you will question which ones are true, because you're so confused by the end of it that you're like, I don't even know who to trust anymore. Because this was a hoax and it sounded real, but this one's not a hoax, but I don't know if I should believe it. Or it sounds more real than the other one. It sounds more credible. Now, with that being said, I believe that to some extent, this is more evidence that actually supports our faith. That we have an enemy, the devil, that the Bible describes as the father of lies, deception, and confusion. The devil is trying to confuse what validates the Bible, right? So I believe that even in that, we can validate that what the Bible is claiming about us having an enemy that's the father of lies, that supports it, right? That's a good way to look at it. But regardless of it, as a person that loves to study and try to find evidence that supports the Bible, that loves to think about these stories and really how we can substantiate that they are true, here's what I have to tell you at the end of all of it. It's all going to boil down to whether you trust the Bible or not. Is the Bible the authoritative, inerrant Word of God? Which I believe it is. So I want to close it up, and I have focused a lot on the unique and supernatural elements of this account, but as promised, I want to wrap it up by looking really quickly at what the account is really trying to convey. This is the most important part of it, right? We could entertain everything possible, but until we understand what the Bible is actually trying to tell us in that narrative, it's just pointless. I'm going to go through this very quick, but here's the first thing. And you have to realize that in this story, because there's a lot of Bible studies, there's a lot of pastors who will preach on this, there's a lot of messages that you will find online. This is a story where you have to understand that God is doing something based off of faith. And often in the story, David becomes the hero. And that's what most churches will focus on, right? David's the hero of the story, and Goliath is the enemy. So I want to go into another verse that is found there, and it's an account where he says, David replied to the Philistine, this is speaking to Goliath, "You come to me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's army, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." This is the important part. "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head." That's crucial. We already sang about this. But we should understand, just like David understands, who the battle belongs to. By faith, he's resting on God's work. So understand that this story is not talking about how you can conquer giants. It's conveying something different. It's conveying about how even David relies on God's strength to defeat. By faith. The second thing, which I often refer back to, is that the Bible is, because we often think it's a set of random stories, even as we've gone through this series. We hear of all these stories, and you think about Abraham. Once again, that's kind of the hero in that story. You think about Noah, he's a hero of that story. You think about David, he's a hero of this story. Jonah, and the list can go on. Understand this. The Bible is not a set of random stories that is meant to inspire us. It is a collection of historical figures that are meant to reveal the person of Jesus. And you have to understand that there's a big difference. When we see these individuals as a hero of the story, we're focusing in on them and saying, well, that's what I have to be like. Now, Hebrews 11 does talk about exemplary faith of these individuals, but you have to understand that they're not the focal point of the Bible. So here's the best way to understand it. John chapter 5, verse 39, this is what Jesus says. "You search the scriptures because you think they give you eternal life, but the scriptures point to me." We often look at the Bible as a way that we can try to get life right? And don't get me wrong, it's definitely a blueprint for life. But one of the things that Jesus says is you're looking to the Bible because you think that that's the way that you're going to get to heaven, but ultimately every single story, every single account, every single individual, it's all pointing to me. That's huge. Because as we read the story of Goliath, now let's reshift our focus. It's not about David. It's not about Goliath. It's about Jesus. What is that story telling us about the person of Jesus? Every story is revealing God's redemption plan and God's redemption story through the person of Jesus. I'll say it one more time. You're not David. Any church that tries to sell you that, they're selling you short. You can't be David. Because Jesus is David. Jesus is the one that goes up against a giant that everyone else that is scared to go and fight him. We're the people that are hiding. We're not David. What's the biggest obstacle for humanity? What's the biggest obstacle that we faced before Jesus came? The power that death and sin had over us. Now, let me just drive the point home that you're not Goliath. This is what 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 54 through 57 says. "Then when our dying bodies have been transformed into bodies that will never die, the scriptures will be fulfilled. Death is swallowed up in victory. Death, O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" It's quoting the Old Testament. "For sin is the sting that results in death, and the law gives sin its power." Those are the two obstacles that we had. Those are the two giants that we could not overcome. If we could, Jesus didn't have to come. Jesus didn't have to be the warrior that would defeat him. And this is what 1 Corinthians 15:57 says. "But thank God, he gives us victory over sin and death, not through our power, through our Lord Jesus Christ." You're not Goliath. I'm not Goliath. You can't defeat the sin in your life. You cannot defeat death. It is a free gift of God. So before I come to a close now, let me drive the point again, one more time, because I think for every time that it's been preached, I could probably say this over and over again. We're not Goliath. We're not David. We're definitely not Goliath, but we're not David. Because you and I cannot help ourselves. We are actually helpless. I want you to picture this as we close. Picture the people of Israel. Picture this iconic story, this iconic account, and picture the people of Israel trying to stand up this giant that would tower, I believe, 9 feet. And he's taunting them, right? Because he knows pretty soon you're going to be you're going to be our slaves. We're going to own you. And picture this story. Now, as much as churches will want to convince you to picture yourself with a sling and a stone, I want to picture yourself not as that, but as a person who is trying to avoid fighting this giant that you know the results, if you do, will end up in defeat, in slavery, and in death. And now, picture David being Jesus, who's going to defeat that. And Goliath is your sin and your death. That's what the story's telling us. Now, keep this in mind as we read what Romans chapter 5, verse 6 states, where it says, when we were utterly helpless, when we had no... You know what utterly helpless means? Have you ever been in that position where you know that you're in a very tough position and there is nothing that you can do? Whether it be financially strained, whether it be deathly ill and there's no cure. Have you ever been in that position? This is what Romans chapter 5, verse 6 states. When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Jesus' death at the cross is a triumph over sin and death, and that is our victory. It's not what we did. His death and resurrection led to our salvation. It has nothing to do with our power. It has everything to do with him. Let that sink in, right? Do you understand that the Bible is revealing the person of Jesus more than it's revealing anything that we can do right? As a matter of fact, outside of the heroes of the faith in Hebrews chapter 11, one of the things that you will see in the Bible over and over again is humanity's screw up. Right? You will see that Peter denied Jesus. You will see that Paul killed people. You will see that Moses killed an individual, ran away from God, refused to do what God was calling him to do, made excuses about it. David had an affair, killed the man. You have Noah who got drunk right after the flood. I mean, do you understand that humanity's condition is not pleasant? Hebrews 11 is focusing on the heroes of the faith because they trusted that God would do what he said he would do. So once again, here's the encouragement. When we overcome our adversities, when we overcome our struggles and the temptations in our life, which we should strive to, not because of our perfection, but because of his, right? That's a standard. It wasn't because we stood up to our giant. The story is not about how we can overcome by our own ability, but how we are able to do everything through Christ who gives us the strength to do it. It has nothing to do with us. When you're frustrated, when you're facing addictions, when you're facing adversities, when you don't feel like going anymore, when you're tired of life, let me encourage you, don't try to muster your strength. Rely on Jesus. Press on Jesus even more. Because you're not David. I'm not David. That's faith in action. Trusting that God's got this even though we can't see past today. Trusting that the battle has already been won and that the results that come are not because of our own effort, but because of our trust that is rooted in the Lord who has conquered sin and death.